The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1876, and when Jacob Bear Morrison read the words scrawled in his sister's shaky handwriting, he knew he would ride through hell itself to reach her. Bear stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and arms corded with muscle from years of trapping beaver and wrestling fallen timber in the Colorado Rockies. His dark hair hung past his collar, perpetually tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was thick and trimmed close to his jaw. He lived alone in a cabin he had built with his own hands, 3 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement, and he preferred the company of eagles and elk to most men. But Sarah was different. Sarah was the only family he had left in this world, and the letter trembling in his calloused hands told him she was in trouble. The words were simple but desperate. "Jacob, I need you. Please come. Robert is gone. I am alone and afraid. They are threatening to take the ranch. Please hurry. Your loving sister, Sarah." Bear read the letter twice more, his jaw tightening with each pass. Robert had been Sarah's husband, a good man who had settled a small ranch outside of Pueblo. Bear had not seen his sister in 3 years, not since her wedding, when he had stood awkwardly in his best clothes and handed her off to a man he hoped would take care of her. And now Robert was gone and Sarah was in trouble. He did not waste time. Within an hour, Bear had packed his saddlebags with dried venison, hardtack, and ammunition. He saddled Thunder, his massive roan stallion, a horse with a temperament as fierce as his own, and he headed down the mountain as the first clouds began to gather overhead. By noon, the rain had started, a cold, steady drizzle that soaked through his oilskin coat and turned the trail to mud. Bear did not slow. He pushed Thunder hard, knowing the horse could handle the pace, knowing that every hour he delayed could mean disaster for Sarah. The mountain paths were treacherous in the rain, rocks slick and hidden beneath running water, but Bear had ridden these trails for 15 years. He knew every switchback, every crossing, every place where a man could lose his footing and tumble into oblivion. As darkness fell on that first day, Bear made camp in a shallow cave, building a small fire to dry his clothes and warm his hands. Thunder stood nearby, sheltered from the worst of the rain, and Bear fed the horse handfuls of grain while the storm howled outside. He thought of Sarah as he chewed his jerky, remembering the little girl who had followed him everywhere when they were children, who had cried when he left for the mountains, who had written him letters every month until she married. What had happened to Robert? The letter did not say, but Bear could guess. Disease, accident, violence. The frontier offered 1,000 ways for a man to die, and now Sarah was alone on that ranch, facing men who wanted to take it from her. Bear's hands clenched into fists. He would not let that happen. The rain continued through the night, a relentless drumming that made sleep nearly impossible. Bear dozed fitfully, waking every few hours to feed the fire and check on Thunder. By dawn, the rain had intensified into a proper storm, wind-driven sheets that lashed across the landscape and turned the world gray. Bear saddled up anyway, pulling his hat low and his coat tight, and rode out into the deluge. The second day was worse than the first. The trail descended from the high country into the foothills, and what had been rocky paths became churning rivers of mud. Thunder struggled through fetlock-deep muck, his powerful legs straining with each step, but the stallion never faltered. Bear leaned forward in the saddle, talking to the horse in a low, steady voice, encouraging him, praising him, promising him grain and rest when they reached Pueblo. They passed through a settlement called Fairplay around midday, a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled against the storm. Bear stopped only long enough to water Thunder and buy a sack of oats from the livery. The stableman, A grizzled old-timer with one eye looked at Bear like he was crazy. "You riding through this storm?" the man asked, rain pouring off the brim of his hat. "Got to," Bear said simply. "Must be important." "It is." The old man nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Good luck to you, then." Bear rode on, leaving Fairplay behind and pushing deeper into the storm. The rain was cold now, edged with the promise of early winter, and Bear's hands were numb despite his thick gloves. Water ran down his neck, soaking his shirt, pooling in his boots. He ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the trail ahead, on the miles he had to cover, on Sarah waiting for him. By evening of the second day, Bear had reached the South Platte River, swollen with runoff and running fast and dangerous. The usual ford was impassable, the water too deep and the current too strong. Bear rode upstream for an hour, searching for a crossing, and finally found a place where the river narrowed between rock walls. It was still treacherous, but it was the best he would find. He urged Thunder into the water, and the horse responded without hesitation, plunging into the current with powerful strokes. The river was chest-deep on the stallion, and the current pushed hard against them, trying to sweep them downstream. Bear gripped the saddle horn with one hand and Thunder's mane with the other, his legs clamped tight around the horse's barrel. Thunder swam with determination, his nostrils flaring above the water, his muscles bunching and releasing as he fought the current. For a moment, Bear thought they would not make it. The current caught them, spinning them sideways, and Thunder's hooves lost purchase on the riverbed. They were swept downstream, water rushing over Bear's thighs, cold and powerful. But Thunder was a mountain horse, bred for strength and endurance, and he found his footing again, lunging forward with a surge of power that carried them into the shallows on the far side. They staggered out of the river, both of them dripping and shaking, and Bear slid from the saddle to check Thunder for injuries. The horse was exhausted but unharmed, and Bear spent the next hour rubbing him down and walking him until his breathing steadied. They made camp in the lee of a rock outcropping, and Bear built another fire, this one smoky and reluctant in the damp air. That night, Bear allowed himself to think beyond the immediate challenge of the journey. He thought about Sarah, about what he would find when he reached the ranch. He thought about the men who were threatening her, and what he would do to them if they had harmed her. Bear was not a violent man by nature, but he was capable of violence when it was necessary. He had killed men before, claim jumpers and outlaws who had tried to steal from him or harm others. He would do it again if he had to, but mostly he thought about Sarah herself, and he realized with a pang of guilt how much he had missed her. 3 years was too long. He had been so caught up in his solitary life, in the rhythms of trapping and hunting and surviving, that he had let the most important relationship in his life wither. He resolved then, sitting by the fire with the rain pouring down, that he would not make that mistake again. Whatever Sarah needed, he would provide. If she wanted him to stay, he would stay. If she wanted him to help her run the ranch, he would learn. Family mattered more than solitude. The third day dawned gray and miserable, the rain still falling in a steady curtain that obscured the landscape. Bear's entire body ached from 2 days of hard riding, and his clothes had not dried overnight. He was cold, hungry, and exhausted, but he pushed on. Pueblo was still a full day's ride away, maybe more in these conditions, but he would not stop now. The trail descended from the foothills into the plains, and the terrain changed from rock and pine to rolling grassland. The rain had turned the grass into a sodden mat, and Thunder's hooves made sucking sounds with each step. Bear rode in a kind of trance, his mind focused on nothing but the next mile, the next hour. His stomach cramped with hunger, but he did not stop to eat. His legs were raw from the wet saddle, but he did not slow, Around midday, Thunder stumbled, and Bear felt a jolt of fear. He dismounted immediately, checking the stallion's legs and hooves. Thunder was limping slightly, favoring his right front leg. Bear cursed under his breath and examined the hoof, finding a stone wedged deep in the frog. He pulled his knife and worked the stone free, then cleaned the hoof as best he could. Thunder stood patiently, his head lowered with exhaustion. "I know, boy," Bear murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "I know you are tired. Just a little farther, we are almost there." But they were not almost there. They were still hours away, and Thunder was limping. Bear led the horse on foot for a while, giving him a chance to rest, but the delay was agonizing. Every minute that passed was a minute that Sarah was alone and afraid. Finally, when Thunder seemed steadier, Bear remounted and continued at a slower pace. The afternoon wore on, gray and wet and endless. Bear's vision began to blur from exhaustion, and he swayed in the saddle. He had not slept more than a few hours in the past 3 days, and his body was reaching its limits. But he could not stop. Not now. Not when he was so close. As evening approached, the rain began to slacken, fading to a light drizzle and then to a misty dampness. The clouds broke in places, allowing shafts of golden light to slant through and illuminate the wet landscape. Bear saw the first buildings of Pueblo in the distance, and relief flooded through him. He urged Thunder into a trot, ignoring the horse's weariness and his own. But Sarah's ranch was not in Pueblo itself. It was another 5 miles to the south, a small spread nestled against a creek. Bear rode through the town without stopping, ignoring the curious looks from people sheltering under awnings and porches. He knew the way to the ranch. He had been there once before, for the wedding. Darkness was falling as Bear turned off the main road onto the narrow track that led to Sarah's property. The rain had stopped completely now, and the sky was clearing, stars beginning to appear in the east. Bear pushed Thunder into a canter, the horse responding gamely despite his exhaustion. And then he saw the house, a small frame structure with a porch and a stone chimney, smoke rising from the stack. Light glowed in one window, warm and yellow against the gathering dark. Bear's heart clenched. He had made it. As he rode into the yard, splashing through puddles, he saw movement in the lighted window. A figure appeared there, a woman's silhouette, and Bear knew it was Sarah. She had been waiting for him, watching for him. The thought made his throat tight. He reined Thunder to a halt in front of the house and dismounted, his legs nearly buckling as his boots hit the ground. He had to grab the saddle to steady himself, and Thunder stood with his head lowered, utterly spent. The front door flew open, and Sarah ran out onto the porch. "Jacob!" she cried, and the sound of her voice, choked with relief and joy, erased every mile of the journey, every moment of hardship. She ran to him, and Bear caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet and holding her tight. She was crying, her face buried in his shoulder, and Bear felt his own eyes sting. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were shadows under her eyes, but she was alive and whole, and that was all that mattered. "I am here," he said, his voice rough. "I am here, Sarah. You are safe now." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his bearded face. "You came," she whispered. "I was so afraid you would not get my letter, or that you could not come, or of course I came," Bear said. "You are my sister. I will always come for you." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she hugged him again, fiercely. "You are soaking wet," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "And you look half dead. Come inside. I have food and a fire." "Thunder needs care first," Bear said, glancing at the exhausted stallion. "The barn is there," Sarah said, pointing to a small structure beyond the house. "I will help you." Together they led Thunder to the barn, where Sarah had 2 milk cows and a mule. Bear unsaddled the stallion and rubbed him down thoroughly, checking his hooves and legs again. The stone bruise on the right front seemed minor, and Bear was confident Thunder would recover with rest. He gave the horse grain and fresh hay, and Thunder immediately began to eat, a good sign. Only then did Bear allow Sarah to lead him into the house. The warmth hit him like a physical force, and he stood dripping on the rag rug by the door, suddenly aware of how filthy and exhausted he was. "Sit," Sarah ordered, pointing to a chair by the fireplace. "I will get you dry clothes and food." Bear sat, too tired to argue, and Sarah bustled around the small house. It was clean and well-kept, with simple furniture and homemade curtains on the windows. A pot of stew hung over the fire, filling the air with the scent of meat and vegetables. Bear's stomach growled loudly. Sarah returned with a towel and a set of clothes that had belonged to Robert, and she turned her back while Bear stripped off his wet things and changed into the dry garments. The clothes were a bit small on him, tight across the shoulders and short in the sleeves, but they were warm and dry, and that was all that mattered. When he was dressed, Sarah ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to him along with a hunk of bread. Bear ate ravenously, not tasting the food, just shoveling it in to fill the aching void in his belly. Sarah watched him with a small smile, her hands folded in her lap. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "Yesterday," Bear said between bites. "Maybe the day before, I do not remember." "You rode for 3 days in the rain," Sarah said, her voice wondering. "For me?" "Of course for you," Bear said, looking up at her. "You are all the family I have, Sarah. I would ride through fire for you." Her eyes filled with tears again, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a while, Bear eating and Sarah watching him. The fire crackled and the warmth seeped into Bear's bones, easing the ache of exhaustion. When he had finished the stew and half a loaf of bread, he set the bowl aside and looked at his sister properly. She was 23 years old, 7 years younger than Bear, and she had always been pretty, with dark hair and gray eyes and a sweet smile. But now she looked worn, her face thinner than it should be, her eyes shadowed with worry and grief. Bear's protective instincts flared. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. Sarah took a deep breath and folded her hands in her lap. "Robert died 2 months ago," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "He was thrown from his horse and broke his neck. It was quick. He did not suffer." Bear's jaw tightened. "I am sorry, Sarah. He was a good man." "He was," Sarah agreed, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I loved him very much." "And the ranch?" Bear prompted. Sarah's expression hardened. "There is a man named Clayton Harding who owns the land next to ours. He has wanted our property for years, especially the water rights. When Robert was alive, he kept Harding at bay. But now," she trailed off, her hands twisting in her lap, "now he thinks you are easy prey," Bear finished grimly. "He has made several offers to buy the ranch," Sarah said. "Each one lower than the last. I have refused them all. This is my home, Jacob. Robert and I built it together. I cannot just give it up." "You should not have to," Bear said. "But Harding is not taking no for an answer," Sarah continued. "He has started letting his cattle graze on our land, tearing down our fences. His men come by and make threats, saying it is not safe for a woman alone, that accidents happen. Last week, someone burned down our hay barn." Rage flared in Bear's chest, hot and fierce. "Did you go to the law?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "The sheriff is Harding's cousin. He does nothing. He says there is no proof Harding is behind the trouble, that it could be anyone." "But you know it is Harding," Bear said. "Of course it is Harding," Sarah said. "Everyone knows it. They just do not care enough to do anything about it." Bear stood and paced to the window, looking out into the darkness. The yard was quiet, the only sound the distant lowing of the cattle. "How many men does Harding have?" 6 or 7 who work for him regularly." Sarah said. More if he needs them. He is a wealthy man, Jacob. He owns thousands of acres and hundreds of head of cattle. And you have just this ranch, Bear said, turning to face her. Just this ranch, Sarah confirmed. 160 acres and about 50 head of cattle. It is not much, but it is mine. Bear studied his sister, seeing the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was scared, yes, but she was also stubborn. She would not give up easily. Pride swelled in his chest. Then we will keep it, he said simply. We, Sarah echoed. I am staying, Bear said. For as long as you need me, we will face Harding together. Relief flooded Sarah's face, and she stood, crossing to him and taking his hands. Thank you, she said. I cannot tell you what it means to have you here. You do not have to thank me, Bear said, squeezing her hands. You are my sister. This is what family does. They stood together in the firelight, and Bear felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness he had not felt in years. He had been alone in the mountains for so long, living for no one but himself. It felt good to have a purpose again, to have someone who needed him. You should sleep, Sarah said, releasing his hands. You are dead on your feet. The spare room is there. She pointed to a door off the main room. What about you? Bear asked. You look like you have not slept in weeks. I have been watching the window every night, Sarah admitted. Waiting for you, afraid Harding's men would come, but now you are here and I can rest. Then rest, Bear said. I will keep watch tonight. Jacob, you need sleep too, Sarah protested. I will sleep tomorrow, Bear said. Tonight I watch. Go to bed, Sarah. She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She nodded and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Bear heard the creak of the bed frame as she lay down, and within minutes, he heard the soft sound of her breathing, deep and even. She had fallen asleep almost instantly, the sleep of someone who had been running on fear and willpower for too long. Bear settled into the chair by the window, the one Sarah had been sitting in when he arrived. He could see the whole yard from here, and the road beyond. He pulled his rifle onto his lap, checked that it was loaded, and prepared to wait. The night was quiet, the storm finally passed, and the stars bright overhead. Bear watched and listened, his body aching with exhaustion but his mind alert. He thought about Harding and his men, about what they had done to Sarah, and his hands tightened on the rifle. He would not let them hurt her. He would not let them take her home. As the hours passed, Bear's thoughts drifted. He thought about his life in the mountains, the solitude he had chosen. He had liked it well enough, the simplicity of it, the lack of complications. But sitting here in Sarah's house, protecting her while she slept, he realized how much he had missed, how much he had sacrificed by choosing to be alone. He thought about their parents, long dead from fever when Sarah was just a girl and Bear a young man. He had raised Sarah as best he could, working odd jobs and scraping by until she was old enough to make her own way. Then he had gone to the mountains, seeking his fortune in furs and freedom. He had visited when he could, sent money when he had it, but he had not been truly present in her life. He regretted that now. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale blue. Bear watched the sun rise, painting the wet landscape in shades of gold and amber. Birds began to sing, and the cattle in the pen stirred, lowing softly. It was a peaceful scene, and Bear allowed himself a moment to appreciate it. Sarah emerged from her bedroom as the sun cleared the horizon, looking more rested than she had the night before. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, seeing Bear still in the chair by the window. "I am fine," Bear said, standing and stretching. His back cracked audibly and he winced. "You are not fine," Sarah said firmly. "You are going to sleep now and I will hear no arguments. I will watch. I am not helpless, Jacob." Bear wanted to protest, but his body betrayed him with a jaw-cracking yawn. "A few hours," he conceded. "As many hours as you need," Sarah corrected. She took the rifle from him and settled into the chair. "Go." Bear stumbled to the spare room and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. He was asleep before his head hit the pillow. He woke to the sound of voices, and he was on his feet with his hand on his pistol before he was fully conscious. Sunlight streamed through the window, bright and warm, and Bear realized he had slept most of the day. The voices came from outside, a man's voice he did not recognize and Sarah's, tight with tension. Bear strapped on his gun belt and moved to the front room. Sarah was standing on the porch, the rifle in her hands, facing 3 men on horseback. Bear stepped out beside her, and the men's attention shifted to him immediately. They were rough-looking characters, the kind of men who made their living with fists and guns rather than honest work. The one in the middle, a lean man with a pockmarked face and cold eyes, seemed to be the leader. He looked Bear up and down, his expression calculating. "Who is this?" the man asked Sarah as if Bear were not standing right there. "My brother," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Did not know you had a brother," the man said. "Now you do," Bear said, his voice a low rumble. The 3 men exchanged glances. The leader shifted in his saddle. "Mr. Harding sent us to make another offer on the property," he said. "He is willing to pay $200 for the land and stock." "The answer is no," Sarah said immediately, just as it was no the last 5 times. "That is a foolish decision, ma'am," the man said, his tone hardening. "A woman alone cannot run a ranch, especially when things keep going wrong." "She is not alone," Bear said, taking a step forward. "And if anything else goes wrong on this property, I will know exactly who to blame." The leader's eyes narrowed. "That sounds like a threat." "It is a promise," Bear said. "Tell Harding to leave my sister alone. She is not selling." The 3 men stared at Bear, taking in his size, the way he carried himself, the gun on his hip. Whatever they saw made them reconsider their approach. The leader touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. "We will deliver your message," he said. "But Mr. Harding is not a patient man. You would be wise to reconsider." "And you would be wise to leave," Bear said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The men turned their horses and rode out of the yard at a leisurely pace, a show of defiance. Bear watched them until they were out of sight, then turned to Sarah. "That was 3 of them," he said. "How many others are there?" "I have seen 4 more," Sarah said. 7 total, I think." "And Harding himself?" "He lives in a big house about 10 miles from here," Sarah said. "I have only met him a few times. He is smooth and polite on the surface, but there is something cruel in his eyes." Bear nodded, his mind working. 7 men against 1 was bad odds, even for someone as capable as Bear. But he had faced worse, and he had the advantage of defending ground rather than attacking. "We need to make this place more secure," he said, "and we need to be ready for them to come back. They will not give up easily." Over the next few days, Bear worked from dawn to dusk, fortifying the ranch. He repaired the fences that Harding's men had torn down, using wood and nails Sarah had stored in the barn. He built a new hay shelter to replace the one that had been burned, this one farther from the house and less vulnerable. He checked every window and door, making sure they could be secured quickly. He moved Sarah's stock closer to the house, where they could be watched more easily. Sarah worked alongside him, and Bear was impressed by her strength and skill. She could handle a hammer and saw as well as any man, and she knew the ranch inside and out. They worked in companionable silence, and Bear found himself relaxing in her presence, the tight knot of worry in his chest easing slightly. In the evenings, they ate together and talked. Sarah told him about her life with Robert, the dreams they had shared, the plans they had made. She spoke of him with love but also with acceptance, understanding that he was gone and she had to move forward. Bear told her about his life in the mountains, the animals he had seen, the harsh winters and golden summers. He found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, about the loneliness he sometimes felt, the questions he had about his choices. "Why did you go to the mountains, Jacob?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "You never really told me." Bear was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I thought I wanted freedom," he said finally. "No responsibilities, no one depending on me, just me and the wilderness." "And did you find it?" Sarah asked. "I found solitude," Bear said. "I am not sure that is the same thing as freedom." Sarah reached out and touched his arm. "I am glad you are here," she said. "I missed you." "I missed you too," Bear admitted. "More than I realized." They sat together in the firelight and Bear felt a deep sense of peace. This was where he was supposed to be. Not alone in a mountain cabin, but here, with family, with purpose. A week passed, and Harding's men did not return. Bear began to hope that his presence had been enough to dissuade them, that they would move on to easier prey. But he kept his guard up, watching the roads, checking the fences, sleeping lightly. It was on the 8th day that trouble came, and it came from an unexpected direction. Bear was in the barn, tending to thunder, when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He stepped out into the yard, his hand on his pistol, and saw a bugboard coming up the drive. A woman was driving it alone, and as she came closer, Bear saw that she was young, maybe Sarah's age, with auburn hair pinned up under a bonnet and a determined set to her jaw. She pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house, and Sarah came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Morrison," the woman called, looking at Bear. "That is me," Bear said, approaching the wagon. "My name is Alina Brennan," the woman said. "I own the property on the other side of yours to the east." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Brennan," Bear said, touching the brim of his hat. "It is Mrs. Brennan," the woman corrected, though there was no ring on her finger. "I am a widow. My condolences," Bear said. Alina Brennan dismissed the sympathy with a wave of her hand. "It has been 2 years," she said. "I am over it. I am here because I heard you stood up to Clayton Harding's men." "Word travels fast," Bear said. "In this county, everyone knows everyone's business," Alina said. She climbed down from the wagon, revealing a practical split skirt and sturdy boots. She was tall for a woman, nearly Bear's height, and she moved with confidence. "I wanted to meet the man who had the guts to tell Harding to go to hell." Bear could not help but smile. "I did not use those exact words," he said. "But that was the message," Alina said, returning the smile. She had a pleasant face, more handsome than pretty, with strong features and intelligent green eyes. "Good. Harding is a bully and a thief, and it is about time someone stood up to him." "He has been bothering you too?" Sarah asked, joining them. "For the past year," Alina said. "He wants my land as well. He has made offers, and when I refused, he started the same tactics he used on you. Fences torn down, stock scattered. I have lost 3 calves to rustlers, and I know it was his men." "Have you gone to the law?" Bear asked. Alina snorted. "The sheriff is Harding's cousin. He will do nothing. No, we are on our own out here." "We," Bear echoed. "You, me, Sarah," Alina said. "And anyone else who is willing to stand against Harding. There are other small ranchers in the area who are feeling the pressure. If we band together, we have a chance." Bear considered this. He had been thinking in terms of defending Sarah's property alone, but Alina was right. United, they would be stronger. "What do you propose?" "A meeting," Alina said. "I can get word to the other ranchers. We meet here or at my place, whichever you prefer, and we make a plan. We watch each other's property, help each other, present a united front." "That sounds wise," Sarah said, looking at Bear. Bear nodded slowly. "All right, set up the meeting. We will host it here." Alina smiled, a broad, genuine smile that lit up her face. Excellent. I will get word out. We will meet in 3 days in the evening. Is that acceptable? That is fine, Bear said. Alina climbed back into her wagon, gathering the reins. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. It is good to know there are still men around here with backbone. She snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, heading back down the drive. Bear and Sarah watched her go. I like her, Sarah said. So do I, Bear agreed. There was something about Alina Brennan that he found appealing. She was strong and direct with no pretense or artifice. She reminded him of the kind of women who had settled the frontier, tough and resilient. Over the next 3 days, Bear continued to work on the ranch, and he found his thoughts drifting to Alina Brennan more often than he expected. He told himself it was just because she was an ally, someone who could help them against Harding. But there was more to it than that. He found himself looking forward to seeing her again, to hearing her speak in that confident, no-nonsense way. On the evening of the meeting, 5 ranchers arrived at Sarah's house, along with Alina. They were a mixed group, men and women, young and old, but they all had one thing in common. They were tired of being pushed around by Clayton Harding. They gathered in Sarah's main room, sitting on chairs and benches, drinking coffee and talking in low voices. Bear stood by the fireplace, watching them, and Alina stood beside him, surveying the group. Thank you all for coming, Alina said, raising her voice to be heard. The conversation died down and everyone turned to look at her. We all know why we are here. Clayton Harding is trying to force us off our land. Some of you have been dealing with this for years. Others, like Sarah here, are new targets, but we all have the same problem. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. A grizzled older man named Tom Farley spoke up. What do you propose we do about it, Mrs. Brennan? Harding has money and men. We have neither. We have each other, Alina said, and we have determination. If we stick together, watch out for one another, we can resist him. How? Asked a young man named David Chen, who ran a small farm to the north. He has 7 men working for him. We cannot match that. We do not need to match it, Bear said, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to him. We just need to make it too costly for him to keep pushing. If every time he moves against one of us he faces all of us, he will eventually decide it is not worth the trouble. And if he does not? Asked a woman named Margaret Prout, who owned a small horse ranch. Then we make him regret it, Bear said simply. His tone was calm, but there was steel underneath, and everyone heard it. Tom Farley grinned. I like your style, Morrison. They spent the next 2 hours hammering out a plan. They would take turns patrolling each other's properties, watching for Harding's men. If anyone saw trouble, they would signal the others with gunfire, and everyone would come running. They would document every act of sabotage, every threat, and they would present the evidence to the territorial governor if the local law would not act. It was not a perfect plan, but it was a plan, and it gave them hope. By the time the meeting broke up, the group was energized, ready to fight back. Alina was the last to leave. She lingered in the doorway, talking to Sarah, and Bear found himself standing nearby, listening. Thank you for bringing everyone together, Sarah was saying. I feel so much better knowing we are not alone. We are not alone, Alina agreed, and we are going to win this fight. She glanced at Bear. With the right people leading us. Bear felt a flush of warmth at her words, and he met her eyes. She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them, a spark of connection that made Bear's heart beat faster. I should go, Alina said, breaking the moment. It is a long ride back to my place. Be careful, Bear said. Always am, Alina said with a smile. She climbed into her wagon and drove off into the night. Sarah closed the door and turned to Bear with a knowing look. She likes you, she said. What? Bear said, startled. "Eleanor," Sarah said. "She likes you. I saw the way she looked at you." "You are imagining things," Bear said, but he felt his face heat. Sarah laughed. "I am not imagining anything, and I think you like her too." Bear did not answer. He was not sure what he felt. He had not thought about a woman in that way in years. His life in the mountains had been solitary, and he had told himself he preferred it that way. But now, standing in Sarah's warm house, thinking about Eleanor's smile and the spark in her eyes, he wondered if he had been lying to himself. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Bear and the other ranchers took turns patrolling, keeping watch for Harding's men. There were a few incidents, more fences cut, a few head of stock scattered, but nothing major. And every time something happened, the group responded together, repairing the damage and making their presence known. Harding's men seemed confused by the sudden resistance. They were used to easy targets, lone ranchers who could be intimidated. Facing a united group was something new, and they did not seem to know how to respond. Bear saw Eleanor regularly during this time. She often stopped by Sarah's ranch to check in, and sometimes Bear rode over to her place to help with heavy work. Her ranch was smaller than Sarah's, but it was well kept, and Eleanor ran it with skill and efficiency. She had a small herd of cattle and a vegetable garden that was the envy of the county. They talked as they worked, and Bear found himself opening up to her in ways he had not expected. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the reasons he had left civilization behind. She told him about her late husband, a miner who had died in a cave-in, and about the struggle to keep the ranch going on her own. "I almost gave up after he died," Eleanor admitted one afternoon as they mended a fence together. "I thought about selling and moving back east, where I have family. But this is my home. I built it with my own hands, and I will be damned if I let Clayton Harding take it from me." "I understand that," Bear said, driving a post into the ground. "You should not have to give up what is yours." Eleanor smiled at him, and Bear felt that spark again, that connection that seemed to grow stronger every time they were together. "You are a good man, Jacob Morrison," Eleanor said. "Your sister is lucky to have you." "I am the lucky one," Bear said. "I spent too many years alone. I forgot what it was like to have people who matter." Eleanor's smile softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. "You are not alone anymore," she said. Their eyes met, and Bear felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that spread through him like sunlight. He realized with a start that he was falling for her, this strong, determined woman who faced the world with courage and grace. Before he could say anything, the moment was broken by the sound of gunfire in the distance. Bear's head snapped up, his hand going to his pistol. The shots came from the direction of Tom Farley's ranch. "That is the signal," Eleanor said, her face going pale. "Tom is in trouble." They ran for their horses, and within minutes they were galloping toward Tom's place, joined by other ranchers who had heard the shots. Bear rode hard, his mind racing. Tom was an old man living alone. If Harding's men had decided to make an example of him, he might not be able to hold out. They reached Tom's ranch to find his barn on fire, flames leaping into the sky. Tom was in the yard, rifle in hand, facing off against 4 men on horseback. Bear recognized the pockmarked leader from the confrontation at Sarah's house. Bear and the other ranchers thundered into the yard, and Harding's men whirled to face them. For a moment, the two groups stared at each other, tension crackling in the air. Bear could see the calculation in the leader's eyes, weighing the odds. "You are outnumbered," Bear said, his voice calm and cold. "Leave now, and no one gets hurt." The leader's jaw tightened, but he was smart enough to know when he was beaten. "This is not over," he said. "Yes, it is," Bear said. "Tell Harding we are done playing games. If he wants our land, he will have to kill us all, and I do not think he has the stomach for that." The four men turned their horses and rode off, and the ranchers immediately turned their attention to the fire. They formed a bucket brigade, drawing water from Tom's well and throwing it on the flames. It took an hour of hard work, but they managed to save half the barn. Tom stood in the ruins, looking around with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you all. If you had not come, I would have lost everything." "That is what we are here for," Alina said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We take care of each other." The group stayed to help Tom clean up, and then they dispersed to their own homes. Bear and Alina rode back together, neither of them speaking at first. "This is escalating," Alina said finally. "Harding is getting desperate." "I know," Bear said. "Which means he is going to do something drastic soon." "We need to be ready," Alina said. Bear nodded, but he was worried. They had won this round, but the war was far from over, and he could not shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. That night, as Bear kept watch at Sarah's house, his thoughts were on Alina. He had not expected to find this, a woman who challenged him and intrigued him, who made him think about a future beyond the next season or the next trap. He had not thought about the future in years, not in terms of building a life with someone. But now, he found himself imagining what it would be like to stay here, to help Sarah run her ranch, to court Alina properly and see where it led. The thought scared him and excited him in equal measure. The confrontation with Harding came 3 days later. Bear was in the yard, chopping wood, when he saw a large group of riders approaching. He counted 8 men, including the pockmarked leader, and in the middle of the group was a man Bear had never seen before but instinctively knew was Clayton Harding. Harding was in his 50s, a heavy-set man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He sat his horse like a man accustomed to authority, and his eyes were cold and calculating as they surveyed the ranch. Bear set down the axe and walked to meet them, Sarah emerging from the house with her rifle. The other ranchers had seen the group approaching and were riding in from all directions, converging on Sarah's property. Harding watched them gather with an expression of irritation. When the ranchers were assembled, a dozen strong, he finally spoke. "I am Clayton Harding," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I own the Triple H Ranch. I believe we have some business to discuss." "We have nothing to discuss," Bear said. "These people are not selling their land." Harding's eyes flicked to Bear, assessing him. "And you are the infamous Jacob Morrison," he said. "The mountain man who rode 3 days in the rain to save his sister. How very noble." "What do you want, Harding?" Bear asked, ignoring the sarcasm. "I want to end this nonsense," Harding said. "I am prepared to make a final offer. I will buy all of your properties at fair market value. You will have enough money to start over somewhere else, somewhere safer." "We do not want to start over somewhere else," Alina said, riding forward to stand beside Bear. "We want to stay here on our land." Harding looked at her with disdain. "Mrs. Brennan, I should have known you would be at the center of this little rebellion." "You bet I am," Alina said. "And we are not going anywhere." Harding's expression hardened. "Then you are all fools. This land is harsh and unforgiving. People die out here all the time. Accidents happen." "Is that a threat?" Bear asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "It is a fact," Harding said. "I am trying to save you from yourselves, but if you insist on staying, on fighting me, then you will suffer the consequences." "The only one who is going to suffer is you," Bear said. "We have documented every act of sabotage, every threat your men have made. We are taking that evidence to the territorial governor. You are going to answer for what you have done." Harding laughed, a cold sound. "The governor is a friend of mine. Do you really think he will take the word of a few dirt farmers over mine?" "Maybe not," Alina said, "but we are willing to find out." Harding's eyes narrowed. "You are making a mistake," he said. "All of you. I offered you a peaceful solution. Now there will be consequences. Get off my property, Sarah said, her voice ringing with authority, and do not come back. Harding stared at her for a long moment, then turned his horse. You have been warned, he said. He and his men rode out of the yard, and the ranchers watched them go in tense silence. That went well, Tom Farley said dryly. He is going to come at us hard now, David Chen said. We need to be ready. We will be, Bear said. Double the patrols, sleep in shifts. And if anyone sees Harding or his men, sound the alarm immediately. The group dispersed, and Bear turned to find Alina watching him with concern in her eyes. This is going to get bad, is it not? She said. Yes, Bear admitted, but we will get through it, together. Alina stepped closer, and Bear felt his breath catch. She was so close he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. Jacob, she said softly, I am glad you are here. I do not know if we could do this without you. You are stronger than you think, Bear said. You would find a way. Alina smiled, a small, sad smile. Maybe, but it is easier with you here. Bear wanted to say something, to tell her what he was feeling, but the words would not come. He had spent so many years alone, guarding his heart, that he did not know how to open up. So instead he just nodded, and Alina turned and walked to her wagon. Be careful, Bear called after her. You too, she said, and then she was gone. That night Bear could not sleep. He sat by the window, watching the darkness, thinking about Alina and Sarah and the fight they were facing. He thought about Harding's threats, and he knew the man meant them. Harding was not going to back down, and neither were they. Something was going to break, and soon. It broke 2 nights later. Bear was asleep in the spare room, exhausted from days of constant vigilance, when he was awakened by the sound of shattering glass and Sarah's scream. He was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle as he ran to the main room. Flames were licking up the curtains, spreading across the floor. Someone had thrown a torch through the window. Sarah was beating at the flames with a blanket, and Bear ran to help her, stomping on the burning rug and dragging it outside. They managed to put out the fire before it could spread to the walls, but the damage was done. The window was broken, the curtains destroyed, and the floor was scorched and blackened. Are you all right? Bear asked, his hands on Sarah's shoulders, checking her for injuries. I am fine, Sarah said, though she was shaking. They threw a torch through the window. I saw them ride away. How many? Bear asked. 3, maybe 4, Sarah said. I could not tell in the dark. Bear's jaw clenched. This was no longer about intimidation. This was attempted murder. If Sarah had been sleeping in the main room, she could have been killed. That is it, Bear said. We are taking this to the authorities. The real authorities, not the local sheriff. And in the meantime, Sarah asked. In the meantime, we prepare for war, Bear said. He sent word to the other ranchers, and by dawn they had all gathered at Sarah's house. The mood was grim. The torch attack had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. We need to hit back, Tom Farley said. Show Harding we are not going to take this lying down. And do what? David Chen asked. Burn down his house. We are not murderers. No, but we can destroy his livelihood, Alina said. All eyes turned to her. Harding makes his money from cattle. If we scatter his herd, drive them into the mountains or onto someone else's land, it will cost him thousands of dollars. Maybe enough to make him reconsider. That is rustling, Margaret Prout said. We could hang for that. Only if we are caught, Alina said, and only if anyone cares. I say we do it, tonight. There was a long silence as everyone considered the proposal. Bear knew it was risky, but Alina was right. They needed to show Harding they could hurt him too. I am in, Bear said. So am I, Tom Farley said. One by one, the others agreed. They spent the day planning, scouting the Triple H ranch from a distance, noting the positions of Harding's men and the location of his main herd. By nightfall, they had a plan. They rode out in the dark, 12 strong, armed and determined. They approached the Triple H from the east, staying low and quiet. The herd was in a large pasture, guarded by 2 men who were more interested in their campfire than in watching for intruders. Bear and Alina crept close, moving like shadows. When they were in position, Bear gave the signal and the ranchers opened fire into the air, shouting and waving their hats. The cattle, already nervous in the dark, panicked and stampeded, thundering away from the gunfire and into the night. Harding's men scrambled for their horses, but by the time they were mounted, the herd was gone, scattered across miles of open range. It would take them days to round up the cattle if they could find them all. The ranchers retreated as quickly as they had come, riding hard for home. They reached Sarah's ranch just before dawn, exhilarated and exhausted. They had done it. They had struck back, but the celebration was short-lived. The next day, Harding rode into Pueblo with the sheriff and 3 of his men. They went from ranch to ranch, demanding to know who had been involved in the stampede. No one admitted anything, but Harding was not stupid. He knew. That evening, the sheriff showed up at Sarah's house with a warrant for Bear's arrest, charging him with cattle rustling. Bear read the warrant with a sinking heart. Harding had moved faster than he expected. "I am going to have to take you in," the sheriff said. He was a nervous little man, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "On what evidence?" Bear asked. "Mr. Harding says he saw you near his property last night," the sheriff said. "Harding is lying," Bear said. "I was here all night. Sarah can vouch for me." The sheriff looked at Sarah, who nodded. "He was here," she said. "He did not leave the house." "That is not what Mr. Harding says," the sheriff said. "Then Harding is a liar," Bear said. "And you know it." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "I have to take you in," he said. "If you are innocent, the judge will clear you. And if the judge is another one of Harding's friends?" Alina asked. She had arrived just in time to witness the arrest, and her face was flushed with anger. "That is not my problem," the sheriff said. "I am just doing my job." Bear considered resisting, but he knew it would only make things worse. "All right," he said. "I will go with you." "But this is not over." "Jacob, no," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "It will be all right," Bear said, though he was not sure he believed it. "Alina, watch over Sarah for me." "I will," Alina promised, her eyes full of worry. Bear allowed the sheriff to put him in handcuffs, and he was led out to a waiting wagon. As they drove away, he looked back to see Sarah and Alina standing in the yard, holding each other, and his heart ached. The jail in Pueblo was a small stone building with 2 cells. Bear was locked in one of them, and the sheriff left him there without another word. Bear sat on the narrow cot and tried to think. He knew Harding had orchestrated this, but proving it would be difficult. And if the judge was corrupt, Bear could be facing years in prison for a crime he did not commit. He spent 2 days in that cell, pacing and planning. On the 3rd day, Alina came to visit. The sheriff led her into the cell block, and she stood outside the bars, her hands gripping the iron. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I have been better," Bear admitted. "What is happening outside?" "Harding is celebrating," Alina said, her voice bitter. "He thinks he has won, but we are not giving up. Tom and the others are gathering evidence, statements from people who saw you at Sarah's that night. We are going to prove Harding lied." "Will it be enough?" Bear asked. "I do not know," Alina said honestly, "but we have to try." They stood in silence for a moment, and then Alina reached through the bars and took Bear's hand. Her touch was warm and strong, and Bear felt a rush of emotion. "Jacob," she said softly, "when you get out of here, there is something I need to tell you." "What is it?" Bear asked. Alina hesitated, then shook her head. Not here, not like this when you get out. Alina, Bear said, squeezing her hand. Whatever it is, you can tell me. She looked up at him, and Bear saw tears in her eyes. I am falling in love with you, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I know this is the worst possible time to say it, and I know you probably do not feel the same way, but I needed you to know. In case I do not get out, Bear finished. He stepped as close to the bars as he could, his other hand reaching through to cup her face. Alina, I feel the same way. I have been falling for you since the day we met. I was just too stubborn and scared to admit it. Alina's breath caught and a tear slipped down her cheek. Really, Bear said. And I am going to get out of here, and when I do, I am going to court you properly. I am going to build a life with you if you will have me. Alina laughed, a sound that was half sob, half joy. Yes, she said. Yes, I will have you. Bear wanted to kiss her, but the bars were between them, cold and unyielding. So instead, he pressed his forehead to hers through the iron, and they stood like that, holding each other as best they could, until the sheriff came and told Alina her time was up. I will see you soon, Alina promised as she was led away. I will get you out of here. Bear watched her go, and for the first time since his arrest, he felt hope. The trial was set for a week later. Bear was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs, and he saw the room was packed. Sarah was there, sitting in the front row with Alina. Tom, David, Margaret, and the other ranchers filled the benches. Even some of the townspeople had come, curious to see how this would play out. The judge was an older man named Morrison, and Bear did not recognize him. He could only hope the man was honest. Harding was called to testify first, and he told his story smoothly. He claimed he had seen Bear near his property on the night of the stampede, that he had recognized him by his size and the horse he rode. He was convincing, Bear had to admit. Then it was the defense's turn. Alina had hired a lawyer from Denver, a sharp young man named William Garrett, and he tore into Harding's story with relish. He pointed out that it had been dark, that Harding could not possibly have identified anyone at that distance. He presented statements from Sarah and several of the other ranchers, all swearing that Bear had been at Sarah's house that night. The trial lasted 2 days, and by the end of it, Bear could see the doubt on the judge's face. On the 3rd day, Judge Morrison delivered his verdict. I find the evidence presented by the prosecution to be insufficient, he said. Mr. Harding's testimony is uncorroborated, and there are multiple witnesses placing the defendant elsewhere at the time of the alleged crime. I find Jacob Morrison not guilty. Relief flooded through Bear, and he heard Sarah cry out with joy. The sheriff removed his handcuffs, and Bear stood, free. He turned to find Alina pushing through the crowd, and then she was in his arms, holding him tight. I told you we would get you out, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. You did, Bear agreed, holding her close. Thank you. The courtroom erupted in celebration, the ranchers and townspeople congratulating Bear and each other. But across the room, Clayton Harding stood in silence, his face dark with fury. He caught Bear's eye, and the look he gave him was pure hatred. Bear met his gaze evenly, a silent challenge. Harding turned and stalked out of the courtroom, his men following. Bear knew this was not over, that Harding would not forgive this humiliation. But for now he was free, and that was enough. The ranchers threw a celebration that night at Sarah's house, and it went late into the evening. There was food and drink and laughter, the kind of joy that comes from facing down fear and winning. Bear stood on the porch, watching the festivities, and Alina joined him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. "About how much my life has changed," Bear said. "A few months ago I was alone in the mountains, thinking I had everything I needed. Now I am here, surrounded by people I care about, fighting for something that matters." "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked. Not for a second, Bear said, turning to look at her. In the lamplight she was beautiful, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes soft and warm. Eleanor, I meant what I said in that jail cell. I want to build a life with you if you still want that. I do, Eleanor said, smiling. More than anything. Bear took her hands in his. Then I am asking you to marry me. I know I am not much of a catch. I do not have money or land of my own. But I can work hard and I can protect you and I can love you with everything I have. Tears shimmered in Eleanor's eyes. Jacob Morrison, you are everything I could ever want. Yes, I will marry you. Bear pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that was sweet and fierce and full of promise. Around them the celebration continued, but for that moment it was just the two of them, the rest of the world fading away. They were married a month later, in a simple ceremony at the church in Pueblo. Sarah stood up with Eleanor, and Tom Farley stood up with Bear. The church was filled with ranchers and townspeople, all of them there to celebrate the union of two people who had fought so hard to be together. After the ceremony, there was a party at Eleanor's ranch, which would now be their home. Bear had moved his few possessions from the mountains, and he was in the process of learning how to run a ranch. It was different from trapping, but he was a quick study, and Eleanor was a patient teacher. Harding had been quiet since the trial, and Bear hoped he had finally given up. But he kept his guard up just in case. The winter of 1876 was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold. But Bear and Eleanor weathered it together, along with Sarah, who had sold her ranch and moved in with them. The three of them worked the land, cared for the stock, and built a life together. In the spring, Eleanor discovered she was with child. The news filled Bear with a joy he had never known, a sense of purpose and excitement that made every day feel like a gift. He spent his evenings building a cradle and preparing a nursery, and Eleanor would sit and watch him, her hands resting on her growing belly. "What do you want?" Bear asked one evening. "A boy or a girl? I do not care," Eleanor said, smiling, "as long as the baby is healthy." "I hope it is a girl," Bear said. "With your eyes and your strength, and your size," Eleanor said, laughing, "I am going to be enormous." Bear crossed to her and knelt beside her chair, placing his hand on her belly. "You are beautiful," he said, "and I love you more than I can say." Eleanor leaned down to kiss him, and in that moment, Bear felt complete. Their son was born in late autumn of 1877, a healthy boy with a strong cry and a shock of dark hair. They named him Robert, after Sarah's late husband, and the name seemed to bring Sarah comfort and joy. Bear held his son for the first time and felt tears stream down his face. He had never imagined he could feel this much love, this much fear and hope and wonder all at once. Eleanor recovered quickly from the birth, and within weeks she was back on her feet, caring for the baby and running the ranch with her usual efficiency. Bear marveled at her strength, and he did everything he could to support her, taking on as much of the work as possible so she could rest. Sarah doted on little Robert, spoiling him with handmade clothes and toys, and the house was filled with laughter and warmth. Bear had never been happier, but the peace was not to last. In the spring of 1878, Harding made his move. He had spent the past year quietly buying up land around the small ranches, encircling them, cutting off access to water and markets. One by one, the other ranchers were forced to sell, unable to sustain their operations. Tom Farley was the first to go, selling out and moving to California. David Chen followed, then Margaret Prout. Within 6 months, only Bear, Eleanor, and a handful of others remained. Harding came to their ranch one spring morning, riding up with an offer. He had aged in the past 2 years, his hair whiter, his face more lined, but his eyes were still cold and calculating. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," he said, tipping his hat. "I am here to make a final offer." "We are not interested," Bear said, standing on the porch with Alina beside him. Little Robert was in the house with Sarah, and Bear was glad for it. He did not want his son anywhere near Harding. "Hear me out," Harding said. "I am offering you $10,000 for your property. That is more than fair market value. You can take that money and start fresh anywhere you want." "We do not want to start fresh," Alina said. "This is our home." "Your home is surrounded by my land," Harding said. "You have no access to the main road except through my property. No way to get your stock to market. You cannot survive here." "We will find a way," Bear said. Harding shook his head. "You are as stubborn as ever, but suit yourself. When you are ready to sell, you know where to find me." He rode off, and Bear and Alina watched him go in silence. They both knew he was right. They were trapped, cut off from the resources they needed to survive. But neither of them was willing to give up. "What are we going to do?" Alina asked. "We are going to fight," Bear said, "just like we always have." Over the next few weeks, Bear and Alina explored every option. They tried to negotiate access through Harding's land, but he refused. They tried to find alternate routes to market, but the terrain was too rough for wagons. They were running out of options. It was Sarah who suggested the solution. "What if we went to the territorial governor?" she said one evening as they sat around the table. "Not with accusations against Harding, but with a petition for a public road. If enough people sign it, the territory will have to build a road and Harding cannot stop it." Bear and Alina looked at each other, hope dawning. "That could work," Bear said. They spent the next month gathering signatures, riding to every ranch and farm within 50 miles. Most people were willing to sign, eager for better access to markets. Even some of Harding's neighbors signed, tired of his dominance. When they had over 200 signatures, Bear and Alina traveled to the territorial capital and presented the petition to the governor. The governor, a practical man who saw the value in infrastructure, approved the road within a week. Harding was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The road was built that summer, cutting through his land and providing access for all the ranchers in the area. His stranglehold was broken. Bear and Alina celebrated by expanding their herd and planting more crops. Their ranch prospered, and so did little Robert, who grew into a strong, curious boy who followed his father everywhere. In the spring of 1880, Alina gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's size, and she was the light of Bear's life. Harding never bothered them again. He grew old and bitter, his empire crumbling as more settlers moved in and claimed land. He died in 1885, and no one mourned him. Bear and Alina raised their children on the ranch, teaching them the value of hard work and the importance of standing up for what was right. Sarah lived with them until she passed peacefully in her sleep in 1890, surrounded by the family she loved. Bear never went back to the mountains. He had found what he was looking for, not in solitude but in connection, in love, in the bonds of family and community. He and Alina grew old together, watching their children grow and have children of their own. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they had fought so hard to keep. And Bear would think back to that rainy ride, 3 days of hell to reach his sister, and he would think about the woman who had been waiting at the window and the woman he had found because of that journey. "What are you thinking about?" Alina would ask, leaning her head on his shoulder. "About how lucky I am," Bear would say. "About how a hard ride in the rain led me to everything I ever needed." Alina would smile and squeeze his hand. "I was waiting for you," she would say. "I did not know it at the time, but I was waiting for you all along." And they would sit in the fading light, two souls who had found each other in the wild and unforgiving frontier, who had fought for their love and their home and won. Their children would come and go, their grandchildren would play in the yard, and the ranch would thrive for generations. Bear Morrison had ridden 3 hard days in the rain for his sister, and in saving her, he had saved himself. He had found love, family, and purpose. He had found home. And in the end, that was worth more than all the gold in the mountains, more than all the freedom of solitude, more than anything he had ever known. As the years passed, the ranch became a landmark in the area, known as the Morrison Place, where the mountain man had come down from the high country and built a legacy. The story of Bear's ride became the stuff of legend, told and retold around firesides and in saloons, a tale of devotion and courage that inspired others. Robert grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's quick mind and kind heart. He took over more and more of the ranch work as Bear aged, and he courted a sweet girl from town named Mary, whom he married in 1898. Grace was a spirited girl, full of fire and determination, and she reminded Bear so much of Alina that it made his heart ache with love. She became a teacher, opening a small school on the ranch for the children of the area, carrying on the family tradition of helping others. Bear and Alina celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1906, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends. It was a joyous occasion, filled with music and laughter and stories. As Bear looked around at the faces of the people he loved, he felt a deep sense of contentment. That night, as he and Alina lay in bed, she turned to him with a soft smile. "Do you ever regret leaving the mountains?" she asked. Bear thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said. "The mountains were beautiful and I learned a lot there, but this is where I was meant to be. With you." Alina kissed him, a sweet, lingering kiss that still made his heart race even after all these years. "I love you, Jacob Morrison," she said. "I love you too, Alina Morrison," Bear said. "More than you will ever know." They fell asleep in each other's arms, just as they had every night for 30 years, and Bear dreamed of rain and roads and a light in the window, waiting for him to come home. In the final years of his life, Bear would often sit on the porch and watch the land he had helped build, the legacy he was leaving behind. He would think about the journey that had brought him here, the choices he had made, the people he had loved. He would think about Sarah, brave and determined, who had called him home when she needed him most. He would think about Alina, strong and fierce, who had shown him what love could be. He would think about his children and grandchildren, the future stretching out before them, bright with possibility. And he would think about that ride, 3 hard days in the rain, the moment that had changed everything. The moment he had chosen family over solitude, love over loneliness, home over wandering. Bear Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1911, at the age of 81, with Alina by his side. She followed him 6 months later, unable to bear the world without him. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a pair of pine trees Bear had planted decades before. Their children and grandchildren continued to work the land, honoring the legacy Bear and Alina had built. The ranch prospered through good times and bad, a testament to the strength and determination of the man who had ridden through hell to save his sister and found his destiny in the process. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, some said you could still see a light in the window, waiting for the mountain man to come home. A reminder that love endures, that family matters, and that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the greatest rewards. The story of Jacob Bear Morrison and Alina Brennan Morrison became a cherished part of local history, passed down through generations as a tale of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family. It was a story that reminded people of what the frontier had been like, of the struggles and triumphs of those who had settled the wild lands and built communities from nothing. Years later, Robert Morrison would tell his own grandchildren about their great-grandfather, the mountain man who had left his solitary life to save his sister and found love in the process. He would tell them about the 3-day ride through the rain, about the woman waiting at the window, about the fight against Clayton Harding and the building of the road. And the children would listen with wide eyes, imagining the tall, powerful man with the kind heart and the fierce determination. They would grow up knowing they came from strong stock, from people who did not give up when things got hard, who fought for what they believed in and held their loved ones close. The Morrison Ranch stood for over a century, a living memorial to Bear and Alina and the life they had built together. And though the Wild West faded into history, though the frontier closed and the modern world encroached, the story remained, a bright thread in the tapestry of American history. A story of a mountain man who rode 3 hard days in the rain for his sister and found everything he had been searching for when he arrived. A story of love and courage and the enduring power of family. A story with a happy ending, as all the best stories should have.